although with Dennis here, it might be good to if there are any questions left over from last time, i.e. any creation, evolution, young earth, older stuff, feel free, as always, to interject those at any point. We don't have to stay linear and continuous in this class, and in fact, I think you could probably argue we're never linear and continuous in this class, so feel free to interject any question anytime. Okay, what we have been, because we're doing the homosexuality, gender, the Bible, that kind of stuff, in March after the speaker comes in to talk, we were filling in, so to speak, the space between here and there. And one of the topics that had come up by request, it wasn't on Katie's list, but I figured she wouldn't mind if we interrupted once with a topic and a fairly continuous address of her ideas, which were also ideas of the class as well. The topic of, we're going to talk about it, kind of doctrine of salvation within the church, but I would like to make it a little more broad initially, and then ultimately, I think the guy asking the question, what he really wants is a cage match between Calvinism and some sort of free will thing, and I've been putting that off for a long time just because I don't know that it's helpful necessarily. However, I'll point out to Vinny as an example. Vinny's one of our mixed martial artists, and it is the case that you can fight within certain rules, and as long as both opponents regard each other and have a similar idea, which is you're not there to kill the other guy, you're there to have a contest of strength type of thing. So I think we are willing this time to probably have as unlimited a discussion as is consistent with the kind of brotherly love and sisterly love that we want to hold up as a goal for ourselves. To that end, I have invited basically the entire elder board in to come and represent that other position, especially those who hold that position. And I think I'm hoping to get Jason Van Dorsten in here next time, Travis McShirley, I think Pete Ferrara. He couldn't be here today. I can't tell if he can't be here next time, but I would love to get basically as many of the elders that hold the Reformed position up here, because full disclosure, if you don't know, I do not hold to the Reformed position. And as a result, I come from a Molinist perspective, which is not well understood, I think, in modern evangelical Christianity, because it's actually an old Catholic position from Alfred Molina during the Counter-Reformation. So Catholic Church doing their thing, Reformation happens. You've got Luther, and then you've got Calvin, and if you listen to the Lutherans and the Calvinists talk to each other, they're not happy with how that relationship goes. They don't believe the same things. But basically, there were writings in the Catholic Church back against some of the ideas that Reformed theologians were bringing up, like John Calvin. And they said, and Alfred Molina outlined a position, which is a position that I hold as well. So I don't hold a Catholic position, but I hold a position that was enunciated by a Catholic abbé. Peter would like to know that the goal is not to be divisive, but to collaborate to get to the truth. Which, okay, good transition. Here's why we're doing what we're doing. And by the way, the interest for an atheist coming into this one, or an agnostic, or anybody, inside the Christian camp, it should be fairly obvious why we're asking this question, because we want to know what's the right way to think of this. For somebody from the outside, if I'm an atheist or an agnostic on the outside, my question into Christianity is, there are 10,000 versions of you guys out there, and all of you think something different about salvation. What gives you the arrogance to believe that any of you believe that you're right? Right? If you all disagree to some degree about what it takes to be saved, or what that looks like, then why on earth am I supposed to believe you? And that's a legitimate question. Like if there's not a good answer to that question, I think it carries some weight. So this is what I've, yes, sir?
Does it make a difference?
It does. It does make a difference if something's not, if what we're talking about isn't true, then there's no good reason to follow it unless it's some sort of deceive yourself and still be happy approach.
I mean, if I believe Augustine or I believe whatever, what difference does it make?
So we'll talk about that because it does. Is there a difference? Matters. So, and part of what we'll say is, in little o Orthodox Christianity, there isn't major disagreement on what it takes.
Is there any scripture that says that it makes a difference?
Yeah, I mean, you've got stuff coming from Paul saying don't be swayed by doctrines. If someone preaches you a gospel that's different than the one that we gave you, and he has some fairly graphic things to say about people who preach a different gospel. Yeah, it makes a difference. Now the question is, how much of a difference, to your point, which we'll get to, let's say there's some core of like, this is what it takes to be saved. And it's my belief that most of what people, let's say that here's the truth about salvation. And then there's this layer around it that says, well, this is the context in which that needs to be understood. And then outside of it are, well, these are the kinds of things that people need to do if they believe this doctrine. These rings just kind of keep going out. I think that most of the disagreement happens in this circle right here. The context, the philosophical background, the understanding that says this is what to do to be saved. And by the way, what is to be saved? That's Christian terminology. I'm not a fan of it at all. Not because the original words didn't matter, but we have made those words mean something different in religion. What we really mean is, and what Jesus came preaching was, do you want to live forever? Right? He came preaching the good news of the kingdom, which was about eternal life. So how to live forever, and also how to be happy. That's what salvation is. How do we live forever and be happy? The method of that salvation, the Christian belief system says this is how it's accomplished.
I'd say the difference, if you get to extremes on what you believe there, is probably the most significant. How you live, how you interact with God, and how you...
Yes, and so
It seems to be the most divisive thing in the church.
Yes, and so if it's a divisive thing, why
If I
not?
was the devil,
Yeah.
that would be a great argument to separate believers.
Yeah, and so what we want to do here is find out.
And it's really true, because people say, if you don't believe the way I believe, man, you're going to hell. And some churches really spat that out. You know?
And so that one of the questions we want to figure out is, why is that wrong, and why are they wrong if they say that kind of thing, or if we as a church say that kind of thing. Now, on full disclosure, I do think, I'll get to my fuller disclosure in a second. Here's how I actually think that you ought to think about the topic at all, and this is not just Christianity. This is a general format that says, and by the way, this general format doesn't just have to do with what does it take to be saved. This general format has to do with how do you know anything is true at all. This has to do with science, this has to do with philosophy, this has to do with mathematics, this has to do with humanities-based knowledge, psychology, anything. Anything uses this format, and so I'm just saying we should use that same method of thinking when we're thinking here. First, you start with foundations. In mathematics, this is what we call axioms. In science, this is what we call, maybe we say the givens or the knowns, or laws that we think are the case, scientific laws that we think are the case. In the same way, axioms, by the way, nobody turns around and says an axiom, let's use an axiom of mathematics. There are some number, 7 to 9, axioms of ZFC set theory. These are the bases for set theory. Nobody turns around and argues, here's my argument for why that's true. The axioms are taken as a given to be true, and then based on that one, here's the system you can build. The same is true in science. We act like science is built entirely ground up, but it's not. So as an example, general relativity, special relativity are undergirded by 2 axioms, neither of which are scientifically provable. And Einstein acknowledged that and said that. The same is true of all scientific knowledge. The same is true of any kind of knowledge, is that there are some sort of axioms that you start with. So in some way, basically, you want to find somebody, and remember what I said about knowledge last time, 99.99% of what you know, that you think that you know, or what you do know, is stuff that's been told to you, not stuff that you discovered yourself. Almost all of your academic beliefs come from somebody else telling you. You didn't perform the experiment. You didn't do the research. Even if you read the paper, you're taking somebody else's or a group of somebody else's word for it. And I recommended that you looked at that Veritasium or Veritasium YouTube video about published research. And I refer you back to that one as well. But basically, in terms of authority, you want to say, when I get my axioms, when I'm looking at my foundations, or when I'm evaluating 2 different or 3 different sets of foundations, first, you have to know that you're getting the other side right. If Dennis and I are going to argue about evolution and creation, it's not okay for me to build a straw man and be like, well, evolutionists say the following things. And then I tell him something that a creationist group says that evolutionists say, right? That doesn't work. By the same token, he can't turn around and say, well, you Christians believe X, and instead of, and he does the same thing back. You have to have good authority for what it is that you're citing. And ultimately, that when we say authority, we don't just mean a source of information. We mean the right source of information. So as an example, if you want to know about Einstein's theory of relativity, what authority do you want to hear from on it? Ideally, you hear from Einstein on it. So you're looking at his primary sources, his documentation, his writings, his papers, his letters that he sends to other people, and then secondary sources. What did the people who spoke with him about this topic, what did they say? What did they think? And then evidence. So, again, back on relativity, it's not enough just to say, okay, this is an idea. We also want to incorporate evidence for or against this theory. And so you want to do all of this when you're looking at the foundations of the thinking that you're doing. And then the other thing that you have to do is when you're evaluating evidence, when you're looking at whether the documentation is relevant, whether the documentation is authoritative, you also are looking within it for consistency. If it's not both internal consistency, is it an internally consistent way of thinking? Because if it's self-contradictory, and by the way, this has been lethal to certain sciences, been lethal to certain philosophies. So the positivist philosophy, a verificationist philosophy, which was absolutely the majority of philosophical position in the mid-20th century. It was what was being taught in schools. It was what everybody believed. Completely crushed, gone. So even like postmodernism, what you keep hearing people railing about, postmodernism is dead in philosophy. Postmodernism is the insanely small minority of philosophers out there. The whole face of philosophy has changed. The reason it's still being taught is stuff that happens in philosophy trickles down slowly through the rest of the humanities and sciences and everything else. And so as a result, you're still seeing things taught today that have postmodern beliefs. You're seeing cultural beliefs that are postmodern in their thinking. But there are no philosophers that buy this anymore. It died when someone pointed out this, the postmodernist says no statement that cannot be empirically evaluated has any meaning at all. It's a meaningless statement. And it was a longer discussion this, but someone basically said, is that statement itself empirically derived or can it be empirically verified? And people tried for a while to fight it, but realized nope, this is internally, logically inconsistent. We're not going to hold this position anymore. So that is a good example of why you should check your position for consistency, but also that knowledge does do this sine wave across there, and we do learn from our mistakes sometimes. So internally, logically consistent, but also remember what we talked about in our project of other beliefs. It's not enough to have a tile that is internally consistent. Here's our internally consistent topic about salvation. Okay, great, that's internally consistent. Is it consistent with all the other things that you say you believe? So I have here we are with an internally consistent view on salvation, but it is at odds with our beliefs about God. Well, that's not going to work, is it? So all of these positions in a systematic theology have to be logically consistent, not only within themselves, but in comparison to your other topics. If they're not logically consistent, they are not true. They can't both be true. And you'll hear people say things like, well, that's man's logic. All you have to do is, we're only going to go on the Bible. Okay, well, I've been over this before. We won't spend any time on this, but you'll remember that we have said you can't even read the Bible without using logic to do so. So when you say something like, this chapter in James appears to be at odds with this chapter in Ephesians, but here's the explanation of how the two can be resolved. You don't even say that if you're not using logic, because what you're really saying is, it seems that James says A, it seems Ephesians says not A, and that violates the law of non-contradiction. However, there is a third option, and that third option says they are not true at the same time and in the same way, and so we're not having to apply the law of non-contradiction here, therefore this is how it works out. That's what this is.
The answer to the whole question, so we can be done with this.
All right, we're done. All right, next topic. We'll go down to, no, just kidding. Hermeneutics is a fancy schmancy word for when you interpret whatever it is you're reading or whatever it is you're hearing or saying. When you do this, just note that when you are interpreting Scripture, when you're even reading something that's been translated into another topic, a language, interpretation has been done. So literally, if you are not reading it in the same language that it was written in, you're not necessarily interpreting it. You've got somebody else's interpretation because they looked at the Greek word, whatever the Greek word was, theos, and they translated it this particular way into English. And it could be translated in several different ways, possibly. And so why did they choose their translation? Why did they choose their interpretation? And if you don't know that, then
What's your general,
you may not know.
your perspective on hermeneutics? Like a three-sentence, this is how you interpret Scripture.
First, recognize that you're using logic to do so, so be committed to being logically consistent. Secondly, understand that you're taking other people's word for it, so if you're going to take other people's word for it, know at least the assumptions from which they come. And what I mean by that is there are Bible translations. When a Bible translation out there, this is now an aside, this is a footnote to your three-sentence thing. Other Bible translations out there are written by people who have an agenda. And what I mean is these guys who published this one come from a Catholic position. These guys who published that one came from a Reformed position. The guys who wrote the King James Bible wrote the King James Bible's interpretation with an idea behind it. It wasn't just, I think we'll start a new translation. There was a reason behind the translation. So know that every translation is coming from a group of people that already hold a theological perspective, and their theological perspective is going to inform their translation. It is oh so obvious when you know, if you go and you check who wrote this one, like the ESV, and you say, I've got a question about whether this one comes from a Reformed tradition or not, and you compare the ESV translations to the NAS translation, you will see differences. And you'll see the differences always line up with a particular theology under one of them, and another under another. And then the third thing I would say is, if you have to go to a proof text, you're missing the point. There are two sets of evidence that you're looking for. Yes, you're looking for big salient points of evidence, but that's not the only thing to do. Preponderance of evidence in the Bible. If it doesn't fit into the theme of the Bible, a theme that has been developed throughout the Bible, it's probably not true. So if someone says, if you realize that everything boils down to an interpretation of a single chapter of the Bible, then you want to ask yourself the question of, is it really the case that God was only clear about this at this one point, through this one author, at this one time, in this one chapter? And if that's your answer, okay. And the second, and maybe the other addendum to that one is, if you're not paying attention to the context, if you're reading song lyric as philosophy, if you're reading a personal letter from one guy to another as a rigorous outline of doctrine, if you're reading parable as stuff that you're supposed to interpret literally, if you're reading apocryphal literature as stuff that's literal, you're doing it wrong. And not only are you doing it wrong, the authors themselves would tell you, what are you doing? That's not why we do what we're doing here.
I'm glad you added the last one, because the first three were reactionary to others' theology. This one's finally dealing with the text, right?
Yes, right.
It's kind of what we should be doing, is dealing with the text.
Well, and the reason I do it in that order is you want to say, before you come to the text, so here you are, here's the text laying over here. We want to go straight for the text and be like, how do I interpret the text? I don't think so. And by the way, not just religion, science. Okay? There's a scientific textbook. You have a certain set of beliefs about this universe. The first step is not open the scientific textbook and figure out what's going on. The first step is to say, before you even approach the textbook, is say, what do I think about this topic already? What are the biases that I hold? What are the reasons for believing? Like when you go to read that book, you're opening it up and you hope to find that science tells you something about the world. And you typically hope to find that the science textbook is going to tell you something that you think is already true about the world. My view of the world includes these things. This scientific textbook reinforces my belief system. I like this scientific textbook, right? We do that with everything. So step one, before you even approach a text, is recognize your own biases, attempt to become as objective as you possibly can. And the process of doing so is to turn around and be like, that textbook was, and also consider the bias of whoever wrote it. This textbook was written. So I did very well on the standardized tests, the SAT type of tests. I did a little better on the SATs than I did on the ACTs. My explanation for why I did well on these, and I think I do better on those tests than my actual intelligence is. So I think I test better than how smart I actually am. And the reason for that was I was able, comparing to other people who take these tests, to put myself into the mind of the people writing it. So you ever come to one of those reading comprehension questions in the old SATs, and they're like, which best summarizes the following passage? And you read them and they're like, none of these best summarizes the following passage. I could pick any of these and they would be true to some degree. I would answer questions like that, and many of the questions had this going on in there, as though I were an East Coast Ivy League intellectual who believed a certain set of propositions about the world. And I didn't know what they all were as a high schooler, but I knew enough about it to say, if I lived in Connecticut and I was writing this test question, this is how I see the world. And so a guy in Connecticut who is a Harvard grad would probably think C is the right answer. And so I didn't answer what I thought was the best summary. I answered what I thought the test writer thought was the best summary, which obviously is the right way to go about the test, but most people don't think about it that way. And so I did better on the reading comprehension than I probably should have. Okay, now that that's kind of out of the way, let me point out what everybody knows, but I'll say it again because it bears being said. 90%, and you'll hear this said in a debate format, people who are in a debate, 90% of the debate is won or lost on the definitions of the words. And the reason for that is nobody agrees or disagrees with the operations nowadays. So this is fairly agreed upon. We know what equals means. This is fairly agreed upon. We seem to think that we know what addition means. What the disagreement is, the conclusion over here, very much depends on what the two things are we're adding together. So if everybody agrees what 2 is and everybody agrees what 1 is, nobody's going to disagree that they add up to 3. Generally speaking, there are a few whack jobs that will, or for people with very, very different perspectives. But at the end of the day, the value of 2 and the value of 1 are really what the equation is about. In the same way, a debate, it's the value of the words that you're using, because the way the words add up, ultimately, almost everybody agrees to that one. Now, one other thing to look for that I'll put in here prior to getting to the definitions is, if you come to the point in the debate, a discussion, something else with somebody, where they basically, you have these definitional discussions, and you turn around and you run the math, and basically you point out that what we're saying here is that 3 equals 4. I want to suggest to you, and this is a loaded point, so know that this is a loaded point, asterisk, this is a loaded point. If somebody tells you that the answer is 3 equals, that if you say, so we've agreed based on what you've said, you're saying that one side of the equation says 3 and the other side of the equation says 4. So you're saying 3 equals 4. And they'll say, no, I'm saying 4 equals 4, and here's why. No, let's add them up again. You said this is 2, you said this is 1, 1 and 2 plus 1 equals 3. You're saying this side equals 3. Yes, this side equals 3. Well, we said this side equals 4. And if you hear the following, I want to talk about the definition of the word mystery for just a quick second. When somebody appeals to mystery, they're misusing the word 9 times out of 10. Mystery doesn't mean logical inconsistency. Not the way that it's used in the Bible, not the way that it's used in, right? When a detective sets out to solve a mystery, the detective is not going out to figure out how 2 logically inconsistent things are both true at the same time, right? The detective is going out and looking and say, there's an actual explanation for how this happened that's entirely logically consistent. I don't know what that is. The mystery is there's knowledge that I don't have that makes these two things, that makes this thing make sense. So anytime someone turns, that is not the same thing as a logical contradiction. A mystery is something that is unknown, not something that is logically inconsistent. So if you see somebody say, this is logically inconsistent and it's a mystery, and man's logic is not good enough to think about this, this is something only God knows, that is completely indiscernible from this is logically inconsistent. Now, you can hold that position if you want, and then I'll get to the two questions here. You can hold that position if you want, but here's the point. You lose the right to tell the Hindu or the Buddhist that their position is logically inconsistent. Because if the Buddhist can turn around and appeal to mystery, all is one, but you said that all this is illusion, and if it's an illusion that all is one, then isn't that false? This is a mystery, and you cannot talk. What is the sound of one hand clapping? And you say, that's not a good logical answer, and they say it doesn't have to be. And if you're gonna tell them they're wrong, you can't then turn around and appeal to mystery yourself. You see what I'm saying? Okay, so keep it in mind that mystery does not mean logical inconsistency. What it means is there's knowledge, there is secret knowledge that I don't have. Let me go in order real quickly. Yes, sir.
That kind of wasn't, you kind of answered my question. It was just, I've never heard of anyone say this is a mystery, but I guess my question was, where does that actually come into play?
I'll bet you dollars to donuts you'll hear the quote over it in the next couple weeks here. Somebody's going to appeal to mystery.
Yeah, so you already mentioned that most of the arguing happens within the context of understanding. Is it possible that, mystery is one thing. Is it possible to say I don't have the full understanding of the context?
Yes. In fact, anybody who tells you they have the full understanding of the context had better be talking about something very, 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 very small and bounded. So I think what we ought to all say is we don't all have the context. But if we're going to make an argument, if we're going to argue at all, the argument can't end with basically, yes, that's right, I got pinned, but I'm going to get myself out of this by saying I'm pinned using man's logic and this is all God's knowledge. That's not okay. And Peter wants to point out this that an argument from ignorance is not a valid argument form. Yes, sir.
It seems like you get two ways of using mystery. Paul speaks of mystery, and the mysteries which are revealed through Christ.
Now that's exactly my point. That's
Now,
exactly right.
That's
Yep.
something else. But we tend to think and use the word mystery for supernatural, for that which we don't know. When you add 2 and 2 and get 6, there's another 2 that's missing.
So
And
I want to say,
anything that we don't know, we call it supernatural. And it's not really the same mystery.
what Paul was talking about, and the way I think of what Paul was talking about was basically, I think of that in military terms. God had a strategy. Part of the strategy you could see, because he said it to everybody. Part of the strategy was classified. Right? So this was classified data
It's revealed.
that God didn't let other people know, lest, and some of the Bible says, lest they.
It's Deuteronomy, and it's these are the mysteries that have been revealed to you. There are some that have not been revealed.
Yeah, basically,
Your children, your children's children.
you remember here we are, we're going to invade Normandy. And the Germans could have probably defended France pretty well if they put all their force back where we were going to land our forces. So we had a classified thing we were going to do. We even found this poor dead guy and dressed him up like an officer and put plans on him and threw him into the sea, and he washed up on shore, and the Germans were like, aha, they're coming in where his plans say they're coming in, kind of thing. And we even got orders for George Patton, who the Germans knew was like our best general. Patton's going to come in here and do this, and he didn't even have a play in the Normandy landing. So it was there was classified data that once we turned around and acted became obvious. One, it kind of becomes declassified in the fact that we didn't land there, we went somewhere else. But eventually it becomes declassified. And when Paul says here, this mystery has been revealed to us, what he's really saying is God's classified plans were declassified, and now we have access to all the information about what it is he was doing the whole time. That's really what Paul is saying. So I agree with you, yeah.
But we tend to use that term mystery in just, presently
Yep,
to explain something, and we call it supernatural.
right. What,
Because we can't explain what occurred.
this is the
When
Scooby-Doo.
the snake talks, or
It's
when
the
the donkey talked, well, that's a supernatural thing. We don't know the reason.
It's
so
the
far.
Scooby-Doo version of it, right? So we think it's oh, look, it's old Mr. McCullough from the broken down, for the caretaker for the broken down fairgrounds. It was always that guy.
Your example was that God is trying to trick us, and then the other thing is.
What do you mean by that?
Well, we tried to trick the Germans, and we did, and we won. We basically said a utilitarian ethic of going like, hey, we're going to do this, and then we actually did this. I'm just saying, probably not the best example to use with God, to be like, hey, God says he's like this, but just kidding, we're landing over here.
No, that's not what I mean to say. Well, it is what I mean to say in one sense, but who is God trying to trick?
I don't know.
Now, it depends on what your view is of the cross, but everybody loves C.S. Lewis. Dennis is, and by the way, anybody interested, Dennis is starting a C.S. Lewis reading group and fan club in McLean. He's his favorite author of all time. Joke. Yeah. Lewis believed in the Narnia salvation deal. Do you remember what happened with the lion? The witch kills the lion because she knew the deep magic, but she didn't. What did it say? She didn't know the deeper magic because her knowledge extended to the foundation of the world. There was a deeper magic instantiated before that says that if somebody innocent pays the price for somebody who's guilty, then death itself will work backwards. And so this is Lewis's child story articulation of a view of salvation called Christus Victor, where Christus Victor was held by a lot of several at least of the church fathers. And the idea of the Christus Victor viewpoint is that God tricked the devil into killing Jesus instead of putting him on a throne type of thing. Because what he didn't realize was that accomplished to a greater degree than anything God's ultimate purpose.
The second thing is you said all when Paul's revealing things, but we know that's not true.
All what?
Revealed all mystery, right? You said now we understand all of this.
I went all of this. What was the mystery of the Messiah and who he was going to be? Yeah, let me scope it a little bit more then. That's what I meant. There was another hand. Or Vinny, did you have something? Okay. All right. So enough then of this. Let's get to the data. What are the definitions that matter? What is it that we want to talk about?
Grace, faith.
Okay. Let's list them out. We'll start with grace, because that's going to be important. And on the other side of grace is what?
Works.
Okay, works. And
Righteousness.
grace is another word, okay, and works, and we'll put righteousness down here. And let me put two other words. Yeah, because this one's going to come in here as well. Okay. Anything else that we want to immediately list? And we can add terms anytime we want. I will tell you that the entire debate about salvation can be solved by defining these 5 terms. 2 of them in relation to each other. And I've already put dashes between them. If you define these things rigorously, and in my opinion correctly, but that's an opinion, then there's no debate. This is obvious, fairly obvious. And you don't even have to get into free will and determinism on this. So this debate, people typically try to boil down to, this is a understanding of, and I'll put the other words that are going to come into it, free will, determinism, and what's the last word? Sovereignty. You're going to see that in here. This is all second order. If you do this part right, all of this follows very, very easily and naturally. You don't have to have the debate at that level. The debate can be had at this level right here and solved. Super easy. Barely an inconvenience. Let's start with this right here.
This is a big bill.
It's a big bill.
You just said it's super easy.
Super easy, barely an inconvenience. That was taken from the Screen Rant guy, that's one of his taglines in there. I think it's fairly funny. Justice and mercy are what? How do those terms relate to each other?
A and
All right, so on the one side, we're going to hear this, that this is A and this is not A. Now, what does Kevin mean by that? What are the implications of what he's saying? These are opposites. They are incompatible. You cannot both, what he's saying is, in the same way that you can't be A and not A at the same time in the same way, if Kevin's right, I haven't said he is, but if he's right, what he's saying is, you cannot be just and merciful at the same time. Those are logically inconsistent. Now, that's one view. What's another view?
Well, everybody gets justice.
Okay.
Not
Now,
everybody gets mercy.
okay. So it could be, well, that's right. Now, we could be talking about, well, let's back up. If what he says is right, and then Dennis next, if what he says is right, that's not possible, because what you've said is, here's a group of people right here, okay, and everybody inside the circle gets J, justice. But there's a smaller circle in here that's mercy. All right, so what we've said is the M circle is part of the J circle. So if you're inside the M circle, you get both justice and mercy. If you're outside the M circle but inside the J circle, you just get justice. And if you're then there's nobody outside of that, we'll just say for whatever. What he's claiming is this. Here's the justice circle, and here's the mercy circle, and there is no intersection of the circle. So from
Is that possible?
here we go. Now, I guess he's going to take a modal approach to this one.
Okay, so after salvation, you go outside the circle. We are no longer in this world.
Say that again. So, well, is it the case that you have, well, then we'll say this, did you receive for any act or whatever, justice or mercy?
Yeah, you're over my head.
All right. Dennis.
My main reason for coming today is I thought you were still in evolution, so I'm kind of lost. I'm intrigued by your statement. Everybody gets justice.
Yes, I think so. Well, everybody's judged, I'm sorry. Everybody is judged, and when they're judged, they get justice.
Well,
That's the way I'm
I'm not
reading.
even sure what you mean by that. I don't mean that everyone is judged.
Because God judges everybody on death, and God is a just God, therefore everybody gets justice.
You answered my question.
I don't want justice.
You don't want justice,
Please.
I object to it.
Mercy.
Yeah, right.
Well, yeah, Dad gives you justice and Mom gives you mercy.
Well, yeah. Hopefully that wasn't a theological point right there, right?
There's nothing left of me for mercy, so.
All right,
Yes,
so
without salvation, there is no mercy.
let me articulate another view for you, maybe.
We'd say without justice, though, the importance of that is that then violence must be taken on by each individual, right? Like if God doesn't bring justice, then it's my responsibility to bring violence to get justice.
Yeah, okay, I see what you're saying. Take justice into your own hands idea?
Whatever if you're an agent then still of God, I mean, because who established,
This would be the nihilistic point of view.
Another way of looking at this is it a spectrum? Right? This is fully just, no mercy. This is the Cobra Kai position. Fight hard, what is it? Strike hard, strike first, no mercy, sir. No? Am I the old guy that knows what Karate Kid is? Mercy, that's just like, it doesn't matter what you do. No consequences for what you've done. No bad consequences for what you've done. Full mercy. And then maybe there's something in the middle, half and half. Yep, I'm holding you responsible for some of it, but I'm going to let you off the whole time. I'm going to put you in jail, but I'm not going to execute you. I'm going to put you on, you're guilty. You should go to jail for 3 years. I'm going to give you probation instead. Is that justice mixed with mercy? Is that what that is? If you get really close on here, it's like, well, put him in for 23 life sentences, but he didn't execute him, so closer to the justice side. Or no, they let him walk. The dad whose kid, he killed the guy that kidnapped and molested his kid, and they were like, community service. That was the one that happened in Louisiana. More on the mercy side, less on the, or maybe you argue like, no, that was just. That was just. So I'm just saying there's some people who might try to say, no, justice and mercy happen on a spectrum.
and there's another thing that, I don't know, I wouldn't say muddies the water, but the view that since Jesus suffered for us, justice was performed on our part, someone else paid the penalty.
Okay, but now, I agree, and you'll hear that said too, we do need to have that discussion, but that will roll into whether it's just or not. So at some point, someone's gonna have to say, well, what is it to be just? That's a good point, but that's a little further down the road.
Isn't this sort of like Old Testament, New Testament? Old Testament's, I'm groping here. Justice and the law was what was under the Old Testament. Under the New Testament, you have Christ coming, and he was full of truth and mercy.
So I think that the law, a lot of people.
You got kind of like one end of the two spectrums. I mean,
So I think that what you just heard articulated, what you just said, sir, is the majority modern Protestant Christian view. I disagree with that. So here's another asterisk out here. I think that most people would say that. I don't know this, but I imagine if you kind of surveyed the church here and went out into the sanctuary and, with your clipboard, how does this work? That's the answer that you would hear. I disagree with that for a particular reason. And I think that
that's sort of what you hear or sense based on contemporary teaching.
yes. So I would say two things. One, if it's the same God, so to speak, of the Old Testament and the New, you shouldn't see a change. He should be consistent throughout there.
Jesus' teaching correction of the Pharisees too is constantly being like, you guys should have seen that God is like this.
Right. Now let me, yes, ma'am.
God continues to strike people dead in the New Testament.
Yeah, so she's getting to the point I was going to bring up, which is in the Old Testament, you might be like, no, it's all about plagues and death and destruction and whatever else. Let's back up a second. Dennis has said, he said, look, I'm an honest broker here. Forgive me for picking on you while you're here, sir. Not picking on you, I'm saying your point. I'm actually going to make.
I've been picked on by experts.
Yeah, roger that. So this should be easy then. Yeah, that's right. If you have, Dennis has said, look, you guys keep talking about this miraculous God that can do anything. I'll admit, if my father was raised from the dead and he came up and said, son, I'm back, let me explain to you how this works, the Dennis would convert on the spot to Christianity. Okay, then correct it.
Well, I said, if my brother were here, and I was here, and my resurrected father came in, told my brother something that only he would know, then told me something only I would know, and then we got together and
Affirmed that was the case. Okay, right. Good point. Thank you. So something that Dennis has got a test for this one, right? And the test basically has to do with something that's truly miraculous, that that we would be like, there's no way that happens outside of there being these supernatural realities. That's what Dennis is saying, within reason. The Pharaoh, nobody died in Egypt for how many plagues were there total? Was it 9 or 10? I forget how many plagues there are. 10 plagues, right? Death doesn't show up until literally all this amazing supernatural evidence has showed up. There's just no reason for you to say no at that point, other than you're in rebellion against God. You're like, I see that you have the power. I don't care. I'm going to do it my own way the second I get left off the hook. So to say that that's rigorously just and no mercy, I don't buy that. The same thing, by the way, I forgot that was a number. And do you know how many times that in Numbers the Bible says that the Israelites rebelled against God before he said to them, okay, fine, you guys are not going to make it in, only your children are going to make it in. Do you know how many times? Anybody want to guess?
Somewhere near infinity.
10. 10 times. 10 times they rebelled, and God said, which matches I don't know if it meant to, matches the number of times that the Egyptians did before death comes their way. And then, by the way, everybody, firstborn in all of Egypt dies. Pharaoh still sends the armies out, and then they get drowned again. And you're like, look, at some point you just can't, there's nothing you can do. Probably shouldn't have run those guys down. I want to say, and remember when God enunciates who he is to Moses, he says, I am the Lord, and I'm going to misquote here, which I should probably know this excruciatingly by heart, but basically, my loving, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness, and my mercy extends to 1,000 generations of those who follow my, or are obedient. But I will by no means clear the guilty, and will visit the sins of the fathers on the third and fourth generation, but to 1,000 generations of those. So he's saying, by 1,000 to 4, there's a ratio of mercy to justice. That's what the ratio is, 250 to 1, according to God, if you did it literally, which is not meant to be literal, but you see my point. New Testament, oh, nope, it's all love and mercy and whatever else. Hey, I've got some accounting questions for you. Did you sell the following property? Did you get this much for it? No? Dead. Boom. Gone. Right? Be careful about characterizing Old Testament as justice and New Testament as mercy.
That was a little bit of the Old Testament God still.
It just leaked over into the New Testament. Yeah.
The funny thing about the stories too is that I don't know anyone that generous right now.
Right, yeah. It was like, I'll sell my
Hey,
property.
you know what, I'm gonna sell all these properties, I'm just gonna give 90% of it to the church.
Okay, so I don't mean to diminish what they did, but because what they said was anybody that needed, they took. Banking systems back then, anybody know what the banks were? When you go to Afghanistan today, or 10 years ago or whenever, if you go and you say to them, where do you do your banking? They will raise one eyebrow at you and say, what is this bank of which you speak? People outside the Kabul or wherever else. And you say, where do you keep your money? They're like, we don't keep money. I mean, you hand a guy a stack of money this big, he does not put it under his bed. He does not walk down to the bank and deposit it. What does he do with that money? He buys land. He buys land because that's your bank. This is my property now. And when you're gonna go, your son's gonna get married and he has to pay a dowry, you sell that land to get the money for the dowry, you withdraw from the bank. So think of a bank in Afghanistan as like the bank of a river. That's where you buy it. And you sell it again. So what they're really saying is they made withdrawals from their bank in order to feed these other people. It doesn't necessarily mean what you and I do. Like the only property Americans own at all, if they own any property, is the property that your house is on. So we read the New Testament and we're like, these guys went and sold their house so this other guy could, no. They made a withdrawal from the bank. That's what it said. And they came in and turned in a receipt that said, I withdrew $5,000. Was it really 5,000? Yes. No, it wasn't. It was 2,000. So that kind of thing. But you see my point. Still, they were awfully nice, and we should do more of that. Yes. Yes, sir.
Kind of small, just historical question, not a little conversation, but how do they keep track of who and what surveying land?
Outside my expertise, but I can tell you how they do it nowadays. They put up stone markers. So in Afghanistan, you go. Some places there'll be a stone by the road, and by the way, touching a stone and moving it, big deal. And you see that in the Bible. So I'm assuming, I've said Afghanistan is Genesis with trucks and guns. And the moving a stone in the Bible carried a significant portion, a stone of a particular type. You read that, you're like, what are you talking about? Moving a stone was equal to like stealing thousands of dollars from somebody. So you go move it over 100 yards and you just stolen $10,000 worth of value from your neighbor. That's what that is. So in some places you'll see where they've actually laid out long lines of stones dividing property. But ultimately there's a marker that's agreed upon. And they do it, and when oftentimes these transactions occur with the council there. So the Shura council, it's done. This guy comes in and says, I'm going to buy this land from this guy. And so you got a bunch of witnesses that are old, long, gray beards that can be like, yep, I saw this happen. We're good here. So there are witnesses that are attest to this one. We do the same thing. We have contracts, and so there's supposed to be a witness that signs it. The witness is whatever random person was sitting there at the time. So we don't really, do it that way anymore. But that's the way they did it there. Okay. Who else? I saw other hands, I think, to this point. No? All right. Then to justice and mercy, let me try to make an argument for Kevin's position, that justice and mercy are opposites, that they are opposites in the same way that light and dark would be. You can have them mixed, but you can still, there are, if they're mixed, it's, what I should really say is this, it's a zero-sum game. So 50% justice and 50% mercy, yeah, that's possible. 70% justice, 30% mercy, yeah, that's possible. And now how you set your percentages is a little bit subjective, right? Or you can kind of pick it. But at the end of the day, we would agree that if somebody killed somebody else and the judge puts him in jail, but he says, I'm going to have a little bit of mercy for the following reasons. And he may enunciate whatever he wants or nothing. But that might be mixed. When the president says, this guy's been put on death row, I'm going to write a pardon for him. The amount of justice in a pardon is 0. That is 100% mercy. All right, so the justice, to the point, I forget who said it, we all get justice. What happened was he was pronounced guilty by justice, so the judge said you are guilty and you should be killed. And the president turns around and says, okay, I acknowledge that, and I'm going to pardon you fully. You're free to go. That's 100% mercy. There's no justice left for the guy that walks out of the prison under a pardon. No justice, all mercy. Or if you say time served, it was 5%, whatever else. But if he deserved death and he wasn't killed, then.
Well, so you have to define all these laws that if you kill someone, then you must die.
Agreed.
As opposed to if you kill somebody, you have to spend the rest of your life in jail.
That's right. That's right. But we'll say that when we're talking about justice, let's assume that justice automatically comes with a certain set of axioms to it, and what those axioms are. So we're just now talking about not what is justice, but what's justice compared to mercy. That's the question.
And then who makes those rules? Because
Absolutely, but that's all entailed in what is it to be
black
just.
man kills a white man, that's much more serious crime at a time than if a white man were to kill a black
Right,
man.
and is that just overall, right? That was a justice at the time, but we'll say that's not just overall, so what's the ultimate justice? Yes. But remember, we're not answering the question necessarily, what is justice yet? What we're just saying is, what is justice relative to mercy? What's mercy relative to justice? And what I'm trying to say is, it seems to me fairly obvious that they are zero-sum, that they are opposites, and so they can't it is incoherent to say the following. This is both fully just and fully merciful. Right? If it's a zero-sum game, you can't claim that some action is 100% just and 100% merciful. It's not that way. There have to be at least 2 acts for that to be true, if this is true.
What's the difference between mercy and injustice?
Maybe nothing. So what you could say is mercy can only be extended by, mercy is a form of injustice. So maybe here's injustice right here, injustice, and here's mercy within it, and the mercy is a subset.
About man's justice, we're talking about God's justice and God's mercy.
Well, let's say it this way. Maybe the difference between justice and injustice is as an acknowledgement that something was unjust in the first place. So,
You find out somebody has abused somebody, and you decide not to proceed with full justice on it.
right,
A
that's,
young boy has been sexually abused, and you decide to
Sounds like injustice.
That's injustice, right? But is that mercy? I think they're different, but based on who's doing it, so I understand that, but I want to make that distinction.
And there has to be judgment. Judgment's not in this equation here.
justice is in this equation. Judgment is in this equation. Now, judgment may not be in the injustice one. So there are multiple ways to be unjust. Let's say somebody was abused and it remains secret. And so you interact with this person. You've never been abused. You don't know that. And right now, then you are part of a system, so to speak, or you are a person who is not giving them justice. So injustice reigns at this point. You have not done anything about it, but the reason you haven't done anything about it is ignorance. You didn't know that it happened. Now, if the person tells you, I was abused by this guy over here, and you shrug and you're like, not my problem, injustice. And so judgment has been rendered. The judgment was like, he may be guilty, I don't care, injustice. Mercy, you go run the guy down, you stare down the barrel of your .45 at him and you say, you deserve to die, but I'm not going to kill you for the following reasons. Now that's judgment, articulation of what justice is, but mercy. What does the person receive? 100% mercy there, no justice. So this is how they interact. Now there may be more ways for things to be unjust, but ultimately the point that you made is, was judgment rendered? That's a very important point, because you can't have mercy. And let me state it more strongly. That's a terrific point. You can't have mercy unless justice is acknowledged. Mercy doesn't mean anything in that sense, because mercy is acknowledging A and then saying, I see A and I'm going to do not A.
I think maybe A and non-A, that is too simplistic.
And then Well, I want to leave it, we want to reduce it to that level because that's where the logic laws, so to your injustice, mercy thing, and I want to be careful about God's and man's because they're not different. They are the same. Justice is justice. There is no man's justice and God's justice. There's only justice.
Man's justice is what I think is justice.
No, that's your justice.
That's right.
Well, that's not you. Man's justice, that's you. You're not man. You're just one guy. I mean, you're a great guy.
And we have a consensus,
Sure.
which we call laws. And our laws in this country may be different from the consensus in other
Do
countries.
you agree with all the laws in our country?
No.
Okay, then we don't have a consensus, do we?
I have a general consensus.
Aha. So my point then is, in God's economy, because God is the author of justice, and ultimately we're talking about God's justice when we're talking about salvation here. The M circle is the same size as the I circle. There is no I. M swells to crowd out the I, because I happens because of ignorance, or I happens because of apathy, or I happens because you don't want to do the justice. God doesn't do these things, so God knows all the data. God's already made the judgment. At the end of the day, there is no I for God. It's all M.
But if it's not different between God and man, then it would be more accurate to say justice and injustice than it would say justice and mercy. And I think A and non-A is making it too simplistic because the difference maker is what you talked about at that second concentric circle, saying there are qualifiers to that.
I'd be happy
God
to.
doesn't make these mistakes because he doesn't not see them.
I'd be happy to agree with that if what we were talking about in here had to do with man's justice, but we're not. We're talking in religious terms. This discussion is happening around God, not around what man has done. This is about what man thinks is the just thing. It's about what God thinks is the just thing. What I said was injustice and mercy don't have any difference because there is no injustice when God is concerned. It's only either justice or mercy. By the concept of God, right? A maximally great being does not do injustice. He can be merciful, but he can be just, but he can't be unjust.
I get what God can't be. What I'm saying though is that maybe this A and non-A is too simplistic because they're qualifiers.
But we're talking about God. And if it's too simplistic, then by all means, what's the third option? Because this could be false dichotomy, right? It's either A or not A, or it's either A or
I
B.
guess are we in agreement in theory and in definition on who God is then?
Yes. So the question is, do you think God can be unjust? Unjust.
The question is God omniscient? Is he omnipresent?
Sure, but I think we're coming from the perspective that says, and Peter asked the question, are you saying when God is merciful, he has been unjust?
I'm not saying that, but I'm asking to clarify because I think we're making simplistic arguments on complex things.
No, I don't. I think ultimately what we're trying to do is show that these are not complex things, and in fact they are simple. So what I don't want to do is appeal to complexity. The right answer in my opinion, is always simple somehow. And in this case, the simplicity here, we're letting the fact that man may not know all the details to say, well, see, there's some injustice. Or man may say, well, I don't care that you've been abused. That's unjust. That's not something anybody is going to say God's doing, right? Do you think?
You just have to have the same definition of who God is.
Yes. Yes, that's right.
Right, and then you have to have a clear definition of mercy and injustice, because in my view, I can't regard God as unjust,
Right.
but I definitely regard him as merciful, so.
So let's talk about the terms unjust, unjust, and just. Okay, and if what we mean by, and they carry some, so now we need rigorous definitions. And we'll do this quickly. Forget mercy for a second, and let's just say that unjust is the opposite of just.
I don't want to forget mercy for a second.
All right. Well, let me ask you this question. Is it just when the president pardons somebody? No, it's not just. It's unjust for the president to do so, but is it merciful?
Might just be
Yes?
political.
Okay, but is it merciful?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's merciful but unjust. So in where there is just and unjust, if they're opposites, then yes, God is, anytime he gives somebody mercy, anytime anybody gives somebody mercy, they are being unjust. Now, the reason that we say this is an injustice and it bothers us, what we mean there by that is nobody's turning around and saying they were convicted and let out. Or sometimes they mean that. But most often they mean nobody bothered to do anything about this in the first place. That's mostly what we mean when we say something was unjust or unjust. Agreed? And Katie and then
If mercy is
Spencer.
the pardoning of sin,
So you're too far down the path. Hold on to that first.
How can it be unjust if God is sort of the executor of judgment? So even if he decided to do something that we may think is unjust, it wouldn't be unjust because he is the just. He is the one that's kind of determining what is just and what's not just.
Okay, so is that true? Can God logically, consistently, is it possible? Is it possible for God to do the following thing? To say, okay, Spencer, or let's use Adam and Eve just for fun. Okay, Adam and Eve, you can eat from any tree in the garden except for this one. Do not eat from this tree. And Adam and Eve are like, okay, and they go eat from one of the other trees, not the knowledge of good and evil tree. They go eat from orange tree 172 on the other end of the garden. And God says to them, because you ate from that orange tree, you're out and you're going to die. Now, is that just of God?
I mean, if he is it wouldn't seem just to me, no. But what I'm saying is, even if he decided to do that, and he said, well, I say it's just, so what?
Okay, the question is it consistent? God says, you may eat from any of these. You may not eat from this one. I give you permission to eat from any of these without consequence. I will give you consequences if you do that one. So what
I
is...
totally agree. I think it would, in my mind, it would be unjust. I would say that's not fair. God.
But how do you prove it to God? That God, let's pretend God did that. He wouldn't do that, but let's pretend God did that.
He told me to do this, and then in return, and God said, so what?
So what does it make God? What does it make God? Because what I would say back to him is, the so what is that you lied.
But then I think going back to his kind of point is that, isn't that man's point of view on what's just?
No, the question is if you said to God, now you're prosecuting God at this point, or you're trying to do what Job did, or what somebody else did, and you say, God, the reason that what you're doing is not just is because entailed injustice has to do with a standard that's articulated and whether somebody's held to the standard. You said I could eat from trees 1 through 99 with no consequence, that it was good for me to do that. Then you said it was bad and I would receive consequences if I ate from the one. I ate from the one that you said was good, and you said I was okay if I did it, and then you didn't act in accordance with what you said, and you did something different. So you lied to me. Now the question is, the question now isn't, is God just? The question is, did he lie or not? So
I agree 100%, but the other side, I'm just saying, is it possible to say that God could say, well, actually, I define what justice is here, and if I decide I want to change that?
Well, a good question. Let me put it this way. Justice requires three things: an articulated standard. Okay? You have to start with that. You can't have justice because articulated standard is, this is what the measure is. Then there's a articulated standard. Then there's an action that happens, or something. Let's say an action happens. And then there's a measurement. Did that meet the standard or not meet the standard? This is what justice is. That's all it is. If you lie in any portion of this one, you have automatically subverted justice. And anything that subverts justice is unjust by definition. So if God says this is the standard, and then he changes it on you, unjust. If you act, action is what the action is. But if he changes the measurement, if he says, yeah, I said I was going to use a yardstick, but instead I'm going to use something different, that's also unjust. So you have to do these, God has to do these two things in order to be just.
It has to be a definitive, universal, forever standard, right?
It doesn't have to be forever. He could say for the period November 12th from the period of October 31st to April 1st, open burning is permitted in Loudoun County. After that, you can't open burn. It's prohibited. But the standard is there. And then the measurement is, did you open burn? Yes. Was it December or was it June? Yes.
So you're forgetting the idea of time within the sense of justice too, because if you read Job 2:3, when God is responding to Satan, he says, "The Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? No one else on earth is like him, a man of perfect integrity, who fears God and turns away from evil. He still remains his integrity, even though you incited me against him to destroy him for no good reason." And the word in Hebrew for no good reason is without cause.
Yes.
consider time into this equation too, because that means that God was unjust towards Job.
Yeah, God allowed Satan to be unjust towards Job. And the question is, did God grant justice?
Strong enough, though.
Yeah, well, let's say it.
Strong enough to make a difference, then that's injustice on his part.
So he did allow the injustice. Yeah, that's right. Now, why? Now, let me before we jump on God too much, or at all. All right. So we don't want to do this without being hypocrites.
I'm trying to pick apart this argument a little bit.
Sure. So
My job is not to jump on God. My job is.
fair enough. All right.
Was God unjust on Christ? The perfect.
Well, don't. Now you're trying to solve the easier problem by going to the PhD level on this one. Hold on one second. Police arrest you on suspicion of whatever else, anything, whatever it is. What are you presumed? Where are they taking you? So you're accused of murder. The justice system says, from the get-go, every man and woman is presumed until proven guilty. Now, what did they do? What do they do with you? They throw you in jail. Is that unjust? We do it all the time. In fact, we think it's the right thing to do.
It's practical rather than ideological.
Why is it okay? Maybe practical, but why is it okay?
Most people are going to say, hey, look, we're 90% sure that this person killed this person with this knife that they still have in their hand covered in DNA.
Yeah.
But since we're not sure, we're just going to let them roam free until.
Yeah. If you
There's
say
a
the
judgment
jury,
call
they
based
say,
on the
well, he's
judge
guilty,
there,
so-
a certain amount of bail and possibilities.
You said if the president pardons somebody, that's automatically unjust.
I asked the question.
This is a true story. I was once arrested and charged with rape, armed robbery, and assault with a deadly weapon. I didn't do it, but I was charged with it now. I was eventually set free, but if I had gone to trial, been convicted, and the president pardoned me, because he's my cousin or something,
Yeah.
and he knows I didn't do it, is that unjust?
Did he know you? Well, ultimately, I'll ask you the question. What do you think?
You just have to accept that he knows I didn't do it.
He does know that you didn't do it. Yeah.
He knows as a fact that I didn't do it.
Yeah. And in fact, he should write the pardon. And when he writes the pardon, he should also say, because I also happen to know that this guy was in it. I say that he should do that. But ultimately, is it unjust? No, it's entirely just. Because justice is about, was there an articulated standard? Was there an action? And how did it measure up? The fact that what happened was the measurement went wrong in the trial, and he fixed the measurement with his pardon.
It's hard keeping all this straight as we switch from God to man and God who knows, who can see the end of it.
No, it's not. It's not. Because in both the case, consider the following. What Dennis's question really has to do with, Dennis does not doubt, I bet you, and neither do any of you, that if he was truly innocent and the law wrongfully convicted him, and a person with superior knowledge, let's say even omniscience, turned around and said, that was not just, I'm going to pardon you. Everybody agrees that's just. Nobody in here thinks that's unjust. Oh, Dennis should have gone to jail, right? Raise your hand if you think Dennis should have gone to jail just because he was convicted of it, even though he didn't do it. We all know the answer to it. It's justice. Dennis's question only is an argument about, is this person's action what we're now going to call the exercise of mercy or the exercise of injustice or the exercise of justice? At the end of the day, that's not mercy. Mercy is the president saying, I know you did it, and instead of you receiving what you deserve, I'm going to not give you what you deserve, I'm going to give you better. All Dennis got when he was pardoned was what he deserved, to be free. That's not what we're talking about when we're talking about justice versus mercy. Katie, and then this is the last one, and we're going to have to, this is a great conversation, we'll have to continue it next time.
As to God allowing injustice, you can't have free will without the existence of injustice.
How's that?
Because it's a fallen world and we have decisions. And if we don't decide perfectly because we're not God, we are therefore injecting injustice into the world.
So you can't have so it's logically possible to have free will and it's logically possible that free will exists and injustice does not exist. But it's no longer feasible because our world is now fallen. Yes, okay, good. Yes, sir.
If I'm understanding this correctly, you're saying that disregarding the human side, because it can get a little murky out here, but from God's perspective, assuming an action was taken, wrong action, justice and mercy is a binary switch. It's either one or the other.
Yes.
That's your argument.
Is it going to be,
The question,
it's not binary, it's not one or the other. So what I'm saying is it is zero sum.
okay.
So it could be the case that, remember I said you get partial justice. So you killed somebody, but the death sentence was commuted to life in prison or to 20 years or whatever else. So partly just, we confined you for 20 years because you did this wrong thing. Partly merciful, mostly merciful, because we didn't kill you, but we should have. Right?
So if it's a spectrum, then the whole A, not A is not.
So it's not a spectrum, it's zero sum. So it is the case that like something can't be both blue and not blue at the same time and in the same way. Something can't be red and not red at the same time, and red and blue are not the same thing. So you can't turn around and look at the purple in the middle and say that is red. That's my point. You can't turn around and say that is blue. That statement's not 100% correct. It's 50% red and 50% blue if it's in the middle of those two. If you took the two paints and you mixed them together, the statement, this purple color is red, is 50% false and 50% true.
So you would never achieve pure justice or pure mercy.
You could, but the second that you extend any justice at all, you have any mercy at all, you have diluted the justice, either completely and changed it into entirely mercy, no justice, all mercy, all blue, no red, or 50-50, 50% red, 50% blue, looks purple. But you can't turn around and say something that's red is red when it contains something other than 100% red. You can't turn around and say something is blue if it contains something other than 100% blue. And the point is that justice and mercy are completely different things, and they are opposites.
Sometimes in real life, though, when you shake a bottle of oil and water, the oil gets small enough that it looks like it's kind of mixing together, and we know it's not.
Right, but
From our perspective,
that's a perspective thing. But at the end of the day, no one, if you took oil and water and you put it together in a bottle and you shook it up and you said, this is all water, that's false. You're 50% wrong. Dennis, even though I said Katie would have the last one and I'm 3 people into this one.
This is the kind of discussion, I wish I could get some of my atheist friends to come to these things. We've all been giving each other high fives afterwards. This Christianity stuff is messed up.
But wait till you hear next time then, and then you'll,
I'm not gonna be here next time.
that would be the one that would be convincing to you.
What is that one about?
The fix to this.
The what?
The fix to this one. I was just articulating the problem. The solution comes next time.
But I have the Kaiser Soze is famous for his quote, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was to convince the world it didn't exist. But atheists turn that around and say the greatest trick God ever pulled was to convince the world it did exist.
Of course, the downside of that one is it's logically inconsistent because in order for God to convince somebody of something that happened, he has to exist in the first place. Therefore, he exists, QED.
Amen, brother.
Dennis, I'll finish with this one quote. So thank you. This has been a great discussion. Let's continue it next time. There's a good solution to all of this that's going to make you'll walk out of this, in my opinion, with, you know how it's blurry and you twist the focus of a telescope and all of a sudden it's sharp? That will happen for you, God willing, next time. You will see things in a clarity that you have not before if you go through this part first. Dennis, to make you happy, do you know who first said what Kaiser Soze said? Do you know who first said that quote that is attributed to Kaiser Soze in that movie? Your favorite man, C.S. Lewis. That was said in Mere Christianity before that. So you guys have a great week. We'll see you next time.